Welcome, everyone. We are so thrilled, could not be more happy to have such a wonderful panel tonight and an opportunity for a do-over for the conversation that we first started talking about in February with the Portland Museum of Art. So joining us here tonight to talk about lessons from feminist movements and to discuss where we go from here. I want to turn it over to the lovely staff from the Portland Museum of Art, our co-hosts and the people who are making this possible for us tonight, to talk a little bit about the Dream Action Factory that this is a part of, because we are really part of a collaborative and community-driven event here tonight. So we'd love to hear more from you about that event.
Great. Thank you, Dusty. This is Christian Adame. I'm the Peggy L. Osher Director of Learning and Interpretation at the Portland Museum of Art. Can everyone hear me okay? Just a thumbs up or a nod would be great. Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. We are doing a revamped version of a program series we launched in early March, pre-COVID closure, called the Dream Action Factory, as Dusty mentioned, which is a series of now online happenings in conjunction with the PMA exhibition, Carrie Moyer and Sheila Pepe, Tabernacles for Trying Times. So we were lucky enough to launch the exhibition in early February. It had about 6 weeks of time for people to come in and explore. We launched 3 of our Dream Action Factory programs with the chart in a knitting group. We had a crochet circle in the exhibition itself before we had to close. So we are just grateful that Maine Women's Lobby and our panelist guests this evening are here to join us in this conversation around feminism. So within this exhibition, queer and feminist artists Carrie Moyer and Sheila Pepe created a site-specific installation titled Parlor for the People, which was really a gathering space. It was an abstracted tabernacle or meeting place, which was setting the stage for conversations around topics ranging from crocheting to community organizing. And there was originally 14 programs in the series. We're lucky that and grateful that we're gonna have about 6 of these programs take place online in the coming weeks. So you can learn more about the series by going to portlandmuseum.org/dreamaction for more information on the full calendar schedule. Basically, the series really invites community organizations, artists, and scholars to convene virtually to discuss a range of topics. We would also like to extend our thanks and our appreciation to our corporate sponsors, Allagash Brewing Company, for making this series possible. So tonight we are super thrilled to be kind of hosting this relaunched Dream Action Factory with Maine Women's Lobby, facilitated by Dusty, for a panel discussion around lessons from the feminist movement, grounded in feminist history, our current moment, and where we go from here. And as feminist artists, Carrie and Sheila hopefully are tuning in from afar. But this conversation is really key to a lot of their belief systems and has really informed their art making practice and their creative practice as individuals and artists. So thank you all for joining us. I'm gonna now turn it back over to Dusty to introduce our panelists and get our conversation started. So thank you all for joining us.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Christian, and Emily as well. Before we jump in, I just want to do some very brief logistics. Right now, all of the panelists are unmuted and everybody else is muted. Depending on the size of our group, we will probably have people submit questions in the chat, but I do really want this to be interactive, so we want you to go ahead and chat questions to us. If you look down on the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a little chat bar, and then you can chat to everyone. If you have any technical challenges, you can chat directly to the Maine Women's Lobby or to me, and that should be able to give you a hand. You'll also see at the bottom of your screen, there's the reactions section. So you can clap and feel like you're, getting to participate without interrupting. You can also do a little thumbs up. And it feels goofy, but it also can give you the feeling of more connectedness. We've been doing a lot of these and really enjoying the opportunity to have people be able to kind of clap and thumbs up and chat in real time. I think that's it for logistics. But the first thing I also want to do is go ahead and drop this link into the chat. This will give you a chance to cut and paste it into one of your browsers. And I'd love if you can just take a moment and let us know what county you're coming from. One of the best parts about being able to do Zoom sessions is to be able to really have people from everywhere. We had folks this morning on a session from Washington County, Aroostook County, all over the place. And I am going to share that screen. So let's take a look and see where people are from. All right, we've got a lot of Portlanders, but we've got somebody from Penobscot, excellent. Okay, Southern Piscataquis, wonderful. We're there up in the mid-coast in Saginaw County. Kennebec. Super. All right, so take a few more minutes if that doesn't work for you, or you don't feel like you want to participate in that, or to get over to that browser and back, no worries. But I want to sort of flex your muscles around using this, because there are a couple other activities that I hope we get to come back to during the event. And so thanks for playing along. And without further ado, I want to take the opportunity to introduce our panelists, or to allow them to introduce themselves. So we'd love to hear from the panelists your sort of name, where you're coming at this from, and kind of what are you bringing into this conversation with you tonight? Just check in a bit around that. Drew, you're first on the screen. I'd love to introduce DrewChristopher Joy from the Southern Maine Workers Center.
Thanks so much. I was just writing down the things that I was supposed to answer. So my name is DrewChristopher Joy. I'm the executive director of the Southern Maine Workers Center. I use he or they for pronouns, and I'm based in Portland, Maine. And, through my work with the Southern Maine Workers Center, I think I'm really thinking about questions of feminism through a lens of work, through a lens of reproductive labor. And I also really want to be bringing in, we're part of a national organization called Grassroots Global Justice that's part of an international feminist movement, and wanting to think about how we are imagining a feminist economy, and also how we, based in the US, are thinking about feminism from an international perspective. And finally, as a trans person, wanting to bring a lens of trans feminism into the way we're talking about this.
Wonderful, thank you. Kim, you are next on my screen. I'm happy to have Kim Simmons, professor of gender and women's studies from the University of Southern Maine.
Yeah, I'm Kim, and I teach at USM, and I am also active in the organizing of the Portland area Women's March. And I think my pronouns are she, hers. And I think for me, the place I'm coming from is this sense of really deep dualities, that there's both this incredible trauma and really terrible crisis, and this potential for everything to change, and visioning, and the possibility of all these new realities. And there's this need for really confrontational politics and burning it all down, and a lot of courage. And there's this need for cooperation and mutual aid and care. And so for me, I just find myself holding the sense of we're at both ends of a continuum that's really dynamic and kind of tiring too, and sometimes a little bit scary feeling. And I have 2 teenage daughters, and I'm fueled by the young people in my life, including them.
Wonderful, thank you. We have Leslie Hill, PhD from Bates University.
Hi, as Jessie said, my name is Leslie. I have been at Bates College for a number of years, housed in the politics department, but a longstanding member, in fact, a founding member of the Gender and Sexuality Studies program there. The thing that brings me to this is, like Kim was saying, I've been struck by the way in which mainstream voices, New York Times, the NewsHour, public forums for news have begun to articulate use some language about structural inequalities. And I thought, is this a real opening that's happening here? But kind of recognizing, as kind of Dusty was pointing out in our conversation, was the need to figure out what lessons do we bring to this moment? What are some of the histories that would help us figure out how to create a context for meaningful change and how to mobilize people around an agenda that really attends to transformation. One of the words that came across in some of the conversations I've been having with listening to feminists.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then our final panelist, Judicaelle.
Hi, everyone. Judicaelle here. Thank you so much for having me. I think for me, this past months have been a place of rethinking what community means as someone who exists at the intersections of race, gender, and class. What community means in need of collective solidarity when it comes to race, in need of collective solidarity when it comes to class, in need of collective solidarity when it comes to gender and sexuality, but also what does it mean to survive together as a community, especially in times where inequalities are so seen and loud, and we cannot move with them into the words that we dare to imagine. And today I have been journaling a lot, which I've been doing most of the time, especially wanting to dare to imagine another word in a system that shrinks us a lot and block us from having new realities mapped by us. I think it's been important for me to dare to write what community means for me as a Black African immigrant in Maine, what it will mean for me as a Mainer, what it means for me as someone who has called this country home, and what should the word look for me, part of different feminist movements after COVID, and how do we make sure we don't take the comfortability that inequality is creating us by the way we are surviving and carry that into the world after this. So yeah, I'm coming from all those kind of spaces and thinking. And I am part of Choose Yourself. We are an organization that does community organizing and movement building by immigrant girls. And our main goal is to start conversation around racial and gender equity. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to hear people, and I realized I was remiss in not introducing myself at the beginning, so I'll be facilitating the conversation tonight. My name is Jessie Holman Sprague. I'm the executive director of the Maine Women's Lobby, and we are an organization that for 41 years has advocated for legislative change on behalf of women, girls, and non-binary folks in Maine. But we're really working to build the feminist structures that support equity and justice for all people, which I think is really what a feminist future is about. So thank you for all of you introducing yourselves. And also a reminder while I have the mic that, mic such as it is, that we welcome people to submit questions to our panelists. So don't feel that you're just here to listen, like you get to be a part of this. So go ahead and send those messages in the chat, and Logan will be monitoring that. So I want to kind of start with, I was happy to hear people talk about a range of different movements. I mean, Drew mentioned the workers' movement, and Judicaelle mentioned, the movements around refugees and people building a new home in a new place and thinking about that kind of transformation. There's not only one feminist movement. These are all sort of intersecting and braided together and sometimes separate as well. And I thought it might be useful just to ground our conversation in the idea of what do we even mean when we talk about a feminist movement? Is there one? Are there many? And what does that mean to you? Sort of, how do you experience that in your work? I'm happy to start with anyone who feels really moved to answer that.
I can start. There is a famous quote that I love. It's a famous quote of Martin Luther King. He says that injustice somewhere is a threat to justice anywhere. It brings us back to when movements start. Many times they stream from lived experiences. People organize because of things they are dealing with on a personal level. Then they build solidarity across what everybody else in their community, in their networks are going through. When it comes to feminism, I'm gonna use feminism with S at the end because it's diverse. There is a need to acknowledge the diverse movements that comes when it comes to women's rights. In terms of sex workers organizing on their own, trans women organizing on their own, immigrant women organizing on their own. But at the end of the day, all these organizings happening between different movements are relevant and they all exist for one major goal, women's liberation. But for those movements to be effective, each movement has to be particular. It doesn't mean that each movement tries to ignore what the other is doing. It just at the end of the day, lived experience push us to do the work that we do. At the end of the day, there is always a lived experience that is pushing us to organize the way we organize. So for me, I think a movement has been a way of trying to say, this is what I'm going through. And how about I try to look the blind spots that I may not see because at the end of the day, I also have privileges that stop me from seeing the full picture. And how can I be part of other people who are organizing within the same lived experience that I'm going through, even more, so I can also have an idea that even though I'm a Black woman, there's also class within us. There is poor women, there is impoverished women, there are also trans Black women, there are queer women that comes into the picture, that even though I may organize around race, there are also levers around my organizing. So I think that's the beauty of movements. As diverse, as plural, it helps us touch all the blind spots that comes with many of us existing at the intersections of different privileges as well. Thank you.
I'll just add on to that I think there's a lot of different tactics that get used in feminist movements, in all social movements also. And so like I think of it more as there's a movement and then there's organizations and issue organizing that what makes it a movement is all that activity that's happening and enough to catalyze big structural change. Mm-hmm. And so the movement's like the container and all that difference is inside of it. And there's usually a lot of conflict internal to social movements, and feminist movements have been the same, historically. People don't all agree, about the right way to get forward. They don't agree what justice and liberation look like, but even more so don't agree how to get there. So what are the tactics? And I think any studies of movements past really like shine a light on how much fighting happens, but really it's the diversity of tactics. When we look back, we needed all of it. We needed all the different strategies, all the different groups, all the local specific organizing that Judicaelle just talked about.
Leslie or Drew, do you want to chime in on that?
What I would add to what both Judicaelle and Kim have said is the way in which movements engage people across the variety of lived experiences to address the injustices that in their separate spaces they experience and pursue some of the solutions they want. But in the process, I think, interact in ways that allow for building a vision. A movement is not going to be able to be particularly successful or coalesce without some shared vision. So that's part of a process that I think goes along with the tactics, as well as developing an understanding across its various kinds of communities about what people are experiencing and what they would see as constituting justice. When somebody asks me this question about what is feminist movement, I often go back to a piece that was very grounding for me, and that was Bell Hook's articulation of the feminist movement, a movement to end sexist oppression. What does that look like in different communities? It may be access to water for some. It may be equitable wages for others. It may, it may be access to substantive reproductive health care. It's going to look different in different places. And so finding the connecting points is part of what happens in the process of movement building and movement action.
Mm. Yes. Yes.
Mm.
Drew, did you have a thought about that?
I wanted to add just that the organizing sort of tradition that I was brought up in is really about base building, and the idea of sort of bringing in people who are directly impacted by issues, especially working class and poor folks, into sort of organized movements. And so really thinking about sort of how are we building a base? How are we politicizing our people to be active in this work for liberation? And so I just wanted to name some of the organizations that I see really sort of taking that approach in this moment. I feel like deeply, deeply inspired every day by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which I think on a national scale has really done a wonderful job of like really centering a feminist model in this moment by organizing domestic workers, mostly women of color, particularly many undocumented women working in some of the hardest reproductive labor that there is in this country, right? To be advocating both for rights at work, but I think Ai-jen Poo, who's the director and the founder of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, comes from a radical organizing tradition called transformative organizing. That's really thinking about how are we transforming ourselves through organizing, and how is that transformation of self also building the power that we need to transform systems. I think when we think about feminism, we really need to be thinking about systems, right? We're trying to undo a system of oppression that shows up in every space that we're a part of, right? It's like the air that we breathe. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of name that part of it that feels really like what has is where I ground my work at the Southern Maine Workers Center, and feels like a really important sort of current feminism that's happening.
Right. And I think, while you mentioned that, not only that they're working toward sort of feminist goals of equity and justice, but also doing it in feminist ways. And I think several folks, while you were talking or talking about that there's not only one way or one vision or one direction we're moving toward. And we have a great comment in the chat box that we don't even necessarily all agree about where we're headed. For example, they give carceral feminism versus an abolitionist. Now, there are so many places in our movement or our movements where we actually diverge about not only where we're headed, but the best tactics to get there. And not everybody agrees that using feminist organizing principles is the right way to get work done. And I think that that's just an interesting observation of our time. I thought I would follow up on that. Oh, and we have another comment about how was the feminist movement of the 70s different than our current version? And so maybe just like pull apart some of those, like what are some of the differences that you see in either how things had happened in the past versus how they are currently envisioned, or how we practice, or even in current times, where are some of the sort of dividing points or the points of friction within our movement or our movements? Judicaelle, I see you thinking hard. I don't want to put you on the spot, but.
No, I am thinking hard because whenever the 1970s movement is mentioned, as someone who was not born, and also as someone who was raised in Burundi in Africa, I have another history when it comes to women's movement. So it reminds me on many untold women's movements that we don't get to hear because they were not written or mainstreamed. That comes on the history of African women on the continent who paved ways for women like me to be in school, to be who we are today. It's not written, it's not mainstreamed most of the time. So we get to read about the second wave movement, the third wave movement, that most of the time is so American rooted. But bringing back to the question on how what I have read and what I have analyzed and across my work, and what I'm grateful is that I get to work on the on the US and then outside of the US. I have seen that we are at a very interesting time. It's the time we are in. I love to call it a prophetic time. It is a time where anything is possible. It is a time where actually to abolish capitalism, it's possible. It is a time where to abolish patriarchy is possible. It is a time where to truly abolish homophobia and transphobia is possible. And it is possible because there have been work that was done by the generations before us that made that today we can dare to be as radical, as bold as we are. It's because of the sacrifices and the foundations of the people who came before us, of the women, the organizers who were in before us, who made it possible, that today we can sit and say, you know what, there is no way women's liberation is possible unless we truly abolish institutionalized racism. There is no way women's liberation is possible unless we challenge homophobia and transphobia. There is no way women's liberation is possible unless classism is abolished, unless workers have their rights. Where you get to realize that all these movements have brought us together to the point where we say, there is a collective global solidarity needed today more than ever. And it's funny because it took a pandemic to the entire world to even realize the necessity of the global solidarity, because inequalities now more than ever, we are aware that it's possible, we can abolish them. And that's what I think we are, and I call it prophetic, because when you read Audre Lorde, when you read Bell Hooks, Gloria Steinem, you realize that they prophesied about these days. They knew we would get there, but for them the revolution was then, but they knew that the work that they were doing would bring us to this moment. And my biggest worry is, what are we doing of these moments where we realize that there is an urgency to question the ways we have been operating within these inequalities. And that's why I say these moments are very critical, because whatever we choose to move forward is how we are shaping the future for us, for the kids, for the next generation as well. And that would be very sad, because we will be wasting the sacrifices of the generations before us that really did their best so these moments can exist.
Powerful.
Thank you.
Feeling that.
Jump on in, Drew. Do you?
Oh no, I don't have anything to add. Like, I'm just, thank you. I was feeling it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, then I feel like.
Jessie, I was just gonna say, I think that one thing that is really different from the 70s is the vast income inequality in our country. Because we still had inequality, and we had a lot of racial income and wealth inequality in the 70s, but we overall had less income inequality and less of the sort of corporate political domination. And so there's some tactics and places where I feel like we can learn so much, and so much of that, the sort of what we were talking about the kind of what is feminist process. 70s feminists spent a lot of time thinking about that and experimenting with different ways. There was a lot of concern of not wanting to reproduce structural patriarchy. And so creating circles, spaces, consensus decision-making, practicing. There's a great essay you can find online called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Arguing back, like, you know what, it's not working, saying we're all gonna be leaders, because it turns out other ways of power and control show up in the meeting. So how are we gonna, be attentive to that? So I think there was a lot of thought about what creates a feminist organization, what is feminist process, and these divides around just what I was talking about before, like, is it more kindness? Is it being more fierce? Is it working on state power, in politics? Like, just a lot of difference, which I think feels the same now. But I do think there's something that we have to get really smart and strategic about how power's been consolidated, because the tactics aren't the same. People just don't have the same amount of time that activists had. They don't have easy access to college. They can't afford to get arrested in the same way. There's just some things that are really different.
If I can build on that for just a second, I think I want to at least start by picking out the point that Kim is making about the difference in context. Neoliberalism has given capitalism, has kind of rigidified and extended the structures of extraction, exploitation, and oppression. And I think what Kim is referring to is the shifted abilities of people to bring energy to that is going to have a big impact on how we organize and how we engage people in those circles and discussions. I also think, though, that on the other hand, one of the things, at least that I see, is different from the 1970s. We have new tools. So, for example, we have language of human rights that we didn't have before. We have global connections that we didn't have before. We have the lessons that we have learned, particularly from women's movements outside of the so-called developed world, that really, I think, will help ground us in thinking about those various kinds of lived experiences that people have. The other thing I think we have from what I've just talked about is ways of thinking not just about women, but about gender and about gender power. And I think that, I was looking over Dusty's questions that she sent to the panel, and I was thinking to myself, what are some of the obstacles that exist in our culture, not just patriarchal power, but what are some of the obstacles that people, that we're gonna have to work through in order to get people thinking about not only how we politicize ourselves, thank you for that language, Drew, but also how do we politicize folks who only see gender inequality when they see women. I think now we have some language to help us think about the power relations and the ways in which gender power, unequal gender power, manifests themselves. So, for example, in the example of the domestic care workers or women agricultural workers, gender is embedded in those ways of production. And so being able to think about that, I think we're much better equipped to do that now and have the possibility of building alliances around some of those things that cross national boundaries.
And not to overstate the obvious, but digital organizing, super different. and a lot of possibility for, hearing from voices that were not, people were more local in those networks, although I mean, incredible national organizing and international organizing happened. But, digital organizing is an incredible tool.
Yes, and that's one of the questions that actually just came in that I think is such a great next step for this conversation, which is how do we utilize the new tactics and technologies, or even old tactics and technologies, but how in this time do we invite people who were previously excluded from the conversations into the conversations and into leadership roles in those conversations, should they want them?
Jessie, I learned a long time ago that if you want to broaden the group of participants, you've got to go to people where they are. You can't expect them to walk into those spaces that have excluded them in the past. And so identifying those openings and asking people, if and how they might like to engage, gets folks who have been involved in particular ways of organizing and acting into the spaces where there are different lived experiences, to understand how people experience unequal power and injustice, and allows them to engage on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
Picking on what Leslie just said, there is also the need that whenever there are conversations happening, to ask ourselves who is not at the table, who should be at this table, and to be intentional about it. And that push us into effective community outreach. So we do not just reach out to people, we intentionally make sure that we reach out to people that deserve to be at the table. And we make sure that we also have the tools for them to be at the table. Because most of the time you say we want to create an inclusive space, but the space that you are welcoming people is not a space that is safe for them. So you are welcoming them into an inclusive space, but not safe for them. And you are not even ready to accommodate what it means for them to be in those spaces. And those brings us back to how different oppressions across race, gender, sexuality puts most of us at the marginalized point, that being in certain spaces demand that certain power be questioned, and that power gets to be shifted intentionally so the space can be inclusive and welcoming. So I think that can be one of the tactics. There's also another way that Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks have talked on making sure that we become each other's keeper, intentionally being each other's keeper. And I think one of the things capitalism creates in us is being individualistic and always thinking about us and our survival first. And when you read Audre Lorde's experiences on dealing with cancer, she mentioned on how her survival was rooted in community. So we have to go back to the power of community. And what does it mean to be in a community? What does it require to exist in a community? And what does it mean to be each other's keeper in a community? And I think this pandemic has taught us that. In times like today, we had to ask ourselves, okay, if I am not losing my job, there's someone else who lost their job. How do I make sure when I'm okay, they are also okay? Even though this pandemic has affected us differently. So we have to go back and apply feminist principle of community. And feminist principle of community are simple. It's making sure that everybody is living a dignified life. And that requires that you intentionally create community.
I think one thing that we need to be organizing people who don't understand themselves to be feminist, right? And providing, but who understand those values, who can relate to it, who understand the things that are frustrating in their lives, that are the things that are hard in their conditions, right? But like don't necessarily identify as feminists or don't necessarily identify as leftists, right? But we can connect with people across those experiences and find those spaces to bring people in and along. And I think that really needs to be a fundamental part of our work, is how are we connecting with people who may not even understand themselves as being invested in societal change, but are connected to the pain of their own experiences, and how can we bring people into the collectivity of change, of doing that systemic change together. And I think that, like, you know, organizing is fundamentally about breaking isolation, and our society, you know, the conditions of neoliberalism feel so relevant to what is different about organizing for feminism right now, and also the real challenges of this pandemic, and so how are we like helping people break out of those isolations and that alienation, and bring folks into movements that both help transform their own lives and make that systemic change happen. And I just wanted to name, sort of thinking about the sort of the feminist values around collectivity and collective care and community care, and the ways that everything about this moment like requires that of each other. I lost my words there, but like, in order to get through this, like fundamentally we have to like put other people like ahead of ourselves, and we need to like take care of each other, and we need to make decisions that aren't about my own well-being or health, but are about the well-being and health of other people. And it's so contrary to like neoliberalism for that to be how we do things, and that it feels really clearly why we're having such a hard time with it. But even just the very act of wearing a mask is so contrary to capitalism and neoliberalism. The idea that we would wear a mask knowing that it is not protecting us, but it is protecting someone else from a thing that we may not have, right? And I don't know, and just something, the practice that we need to do, that we're getting in doing that for each other, feels really important about this moment, and is one of the openings that exists here. I lost the thread, but I'll land there. Wearing masks is a feminist movement.
Good. Just quickly, Drew, you're so right. And I think that part of what I hear when you're talking about that is how the idea of coming together to get through this is, around the health issues, is being situated is directly opposed to opening up the economy and recovering economically. And so your question about how to get people who share feminist values and feminist goals to recognize, to see themselves in a movement is, I think it's a really critical question. Thank you.
And I think, like, particularly, you know, like I spend a lot of my life right now talking to workers who are either lost work or who are working in really hard conditions right now. And the reality of like who are essential workers, like they are women of color. Like disproportionately, that is who is continuing to work through this pandemic. They're care workers, they are nurses, they're working in hospitals, they're cleaning houses, they're working in grocery stores, right? And so as we think about reopening the economy, I think there's a question of like, who are we culturally willing to sacrifice, and how do we make an intervention around that as all of us, right? Because I think that is really what we're up against right now. And that is like, through whatever ways that we can, like our obligation to respond to and step up to in this moment.
Right, and when we apply sort of purity tests around language or belonging to certain groups or sects, then we exclude all those other folks who maybe, don't have the time, the access, the education, the lived experience, whatever, that helps them to feel that they are in fact part of that movement. I was just telling a story recently of, I realized my mother graduated from high school in 1975 and was, a peak at the beginning of the women's movement, and asked her, what was that like? And she said, it was like nothing. I paid zero attention to it because it was for rich ladies. And she was very profoundly poor. There was no room for her in that. And yet she was engaged in feminist work, in social change, and had a lived experience that was of value to that. But if we only sort of allow in or invite spaces for people who pass like our language tests, our purity tests, or who have read the same books we have, then all the people you've just named, Drew, like not all of them, but they don't have a space, and yet it is for them. They are already the leaders of this work in many ways. Sorry, I feel like I co-opted the conversation.
I think some of it goes to Judicaelle's point earlier about how movements get narrated, who gets to tell the story, and who's claiming the story of what is feminism is super contested. And obviously we have some pretty strong anti-feminist opponents who are going to try to tell one kind of a story as well. And so I think somehow being able to highlight, I just went to a webinar about the women's suffrage movement, and all these stories of really local organizing that I had never heard, and the kind of unique tactics and the on the ground work that all different kinds of groups were doing, that get lost in the narration. And so for me, some curiosity moving forward is how we manage all of our information systems. We're getting so much all the time, to be able to see and hear what is the really cool feminist work people are doing in their specific local communities. How do we amplify, the network, thinking about feminism in a much broader way.
Mm. Yeah.
And I guess I just want to say one last thing is that I think one way that the opposition has done a really good job is making it seem like a super slog, that social change and activism and feminism is no fun, not worth it. It's going to take all your time and get you, only misery. And so telling stories of organizing as breaking isolation, as building community, as having creativity and fun. And I think the most inspiring kind of work that I've been reading is that Adrienne Marie Brown's thinking around pleasure activism and reclaiming pleasure and creating activist space that is inherently a good place to be, and learning how to be good to ourselves and each other as part of that activism. And so I feel like, we can make it, we have to claim meaning making.
Mm. I'm loving hearing some of these tactics and strategies that are about care and collaboration and pleasure. Let's think for a few minutes. What are some of the other sort of those lessons that we've learned from folks who have effectively moved change forward? What are the tactics and strategies that we can pursue today in small scales and in big scale? What's on your to-do list? I want to jump in.
What's on my to-do list? Wow. I think for me, my to-do list lately have been on trying to connect the feminist movement I'm part of here to the African feminist movement. And I think that intersection came after I read a lot of Audre Lorde, came after I found a collection of letters she was exchanging with Winnie Mandela in South Africa, showing her support for the apartheid work, anti-apartheid movement that Winnie was creating. So that brought me back to how most of these stories are not told. These movements on this country are told as if they only existed here, but we have Angela Davis, who continuously supported other movements outside of the country. And that brought me to the idea that freedom is collective. It's collective in terms of it's global. And when freedom is global, it also helps you view yourself not as one part of only one country, but as other many different struggles. So my to-do list has been to try to find those intersections and to try to learn on what is being done here that is effective and what is being done outside of here that is effective. And to be honest, there's a lot of women's movement outside of this country that are so effective. And you get to ask yourself, when will this country get on board? When will this country understand collective organizing, collective care, and it also opened your eyes to neoliberalism in this country, how we glamorized activism, how it has become a glamour thing, while on others are really protesting for their lives. They're in the street for their lives. The woman in Mexico, the woman in Cambodia. So it opens your eyes to different realities that question your own ways of organizing. So, but the other thing I've learned lately is how to intentionally organize. Because we live in a time where making sure that marginalized people are at the table have become a form of tokenism. So you do it to make sure it's inclusive, but you don't question who are you bringing at the table. So you find yourself always bringing the same person. Always. So it becomes one person from the marginalized community that gets that spot for 20 years. Nobody else is welcomed. Nobody else is invited. That one person become a monument. And that becomes problematic because most of the time, the people who are holding a lot of privilege don't even get to ask, how do we make sure many more of you are welcomed? How do we make sure we are supporting trans women organizing so we don't have only one trans women at the table, but we have 10, 20, 30. How do we make sure refugee women are being empowered? So we have 30 at the table. So it also realizing that effective organizing is intentional, is making sure that everybody is there. So that's what I've been learning. And there's a good question that I saw on the meaning of feminist work and the process of engaging marginalized people. So that's exactly what I'm saying. The first step is to intentionally engage them intentionally. And when you engage someone intentionally, you truly want them to be in that space. It's not like I want you to come or not. I truly want you to be there. So I'm gonna do all that is possible to make sure that you are present. And that is intentional. You make sure they're comfortable enough to be present. You make sure that they are well catered enough to be present. You make sure that they really feel like they belong there. And that is the first step. And the rest, it comes as people organize together, I guess.
I'd invite our other panelists, if you have something that's on the tip of your tongue there, to follow up on that. I also have another question waiting in the wings. So, oh, Leslie, did you have something, or am I?
I think the conversation has been very thoughtful about what we need to do to build movement. And as I've been hearing this and was doing, a little bit of going over the article that you sent, Dusty, it occurred to me to think about what we're up against. And as Kim was saying earlier, the kind of tactics we need to use in order to challenge the current ways of thinking, the current kind of patterns, habits of thought, the assumptions that activism is no fun and might even be dangerous to an individual. How do we, so for example, you know, just picking up on the thread of one thing that Judicaelle just said, it's about how do we not just feature women as the important part of the story, but begin to engage people in thinking about how do we displace the masculine norm? How do we displace the expectations that we need to build a society where everybody can have the experience of a wealthy, racially gender dominant individual? It's, you know, how do we begin to shift? I don't think meaningful, substantive policy kind of change can come as long as we hold on to the old standards and norms that are based around these particular privileged notions of what experience and success mean. I think until we break into that somehow and get people thinking about decentering whiteness, decentering masculine norms that come with values about competition and militarism. I really think part of the work we need to do needs to get to what are we facing, both in terms of the expectations that people have about society, as well as the patterns of ways in which they engage each other in order to be able to build something different.
And one of the questions submitted on Facebook was quite related to that, you know, has commercialization of power in the past sort of shielded misogyny and racism? And as we have started to peel back those layers, are we now addressing something that is, as we start to really undo racism and the patriarchy and harmful gender norms, is our battle and our tactics changing? And there I am using military terms, right? Because we're all swimming in that soup, but changing because we are now pursuing something even deeper rooted or hidden or protected in different ways. I'm happy to hear from other folks about what are the strategies that are working to really radically change how we think about our world and how we build our world.
I agree with Leslie in that we have to hold that vision, you know, and start to build and try to keep figuring it out. But I think that goes to my sort of continuum. I also feel like we're chipping away at really urgent things in this kind of fire hose way that's very practical and immediate. So are we going to have an election? How will we preserve voting rights or create voting rights? Like, all this is actually not that new. It's really old and, you know, frustrating to not have more wins in the last decades. How will we get paid family and medical leave for every single person? How will we have, you know, separate health insurance from employment? How will we take care of children and not essentialize mothers as like wanting to do it 24/7? How will we, like, there's just so many of the practical small bits where we don't necessarily have agreement. And yet we do have some sort of way of like, we have to get to a little bit more stable place where we have preserved some basic human rights. And so I find a tension between that, the urgency of like, call Susan Collins, like, what are we doing here? Like, do the really concrete work. And then also, if we don't take a breath and try to see what else is possible and what are some of the tactics that might come from more creative, more, a lot, I think, around strikes and ways of using non-compliance and more creative ways, like especially while we're home, more trying to think about non-compliance in some different kinds of ways. So I think there's room for creative tactics, and then also a lot of people doing the like electoral policy work right now.
I think there's something to like there is an opportunity in this moment, right? There's like a lot of really scary stuff, really scary stuff, and there's a lot of opportunity in this moment. And I think that part of the reason why organizing is so important is that it helps us be prepared for these moments. And so from like a labor perspective, like what I see as I'm like trying, you know, people want to start organizing right now. Lots of people are coming to us being like, things are bad at work. Like I'm not being like the mask is being peeled off for a lot of people. People are like, my employer does not give a shit about my life. And I didn't understand that before, and I understand it now, right? And I want to do something about that. And it's worth the risk now because I know that I'm not valued. But where we can actually make progress with that is like places where people were already organizing. So when we see that there are places that are going on strike, it's not because people in those places just all of a sudden decided to go on strike. It's because the building block, the foundation for that, that action was already there and happened sort of in a time where there was less urgency or less, you know, so I think that like the organizing piece and the preparing ourselves for these moments is really important. And I also think that where we're seeing sort of real progress being made in terms of like concrete wins, but I also think in like really owning the discourse and pushing the discourse in this moment is like, you know, the abolitionist movement, I think has been prison abolitionist movement has been very successful in using this moment to really talk about why prisons are bad. And there's this opening to have people connect to that in a different way. And I think that they were prepared because they've been pushing this thing that everyone says is impossible, right? We can't abolish prisons. That's ridiculous. Why are we even saying that? But they've been saying it anyway, and they're practiced, and they know their talking points, and they know what it, you know, they know how to say the things and are able to say it strategically in this moment. And I think that that's really powerful. And, you know, the other issue that we work on is universal health care. And I think that if there was ever, you know, there's been building momentum around Medicare for all and all of that sort of in this period coming up to this. But if there was ever a moment for us to be like very crystal clear and unabashed and uncompromising in our stand on healthcare, like that moment is now, because it's obvious that the system that we have for healthcare in this country does not work, is not set up for a pandemic, is harming people, especially as we have mass unemployment. And we need to not back off of that. We need to be saying the only solution to this crisis right now is universal healthcare. And so I think just like really the practice of being organized and saying into the world the things that we know will create justice for our people is something that we have to do it all of the time in order to be able to be prepared in the moments that are these opportunities to really take advantage of it.
That's cool, Drew.
Oh, Jessie, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. One of the questions submitted is about what can our organizing, what can we learn from climate activism and how both movements can work together. And I really think of climate activism as a feminist movement, or feminist adjacent at least. And so I think of that that conversation that you bring into it, Drew, about, you know, the working for healthcare, working for abolition, like all of these different steps are interrelated, and we need to be learning from each other in the same way, you know, the COVID response has learned from the AIDS response and HIV response, like to be looking outside our tunnels, and learning from what has gone really well.
I just quickly in response to that, so the organization that we work with nationally, Grassroots Global Justice, has started using this language around like a just transition to a feminist economy, and sort of like, I think really working with the idea of a just transition that's happening in the climate movement, and connecting that to the idea of a feminist economy. And so I think that there are these places where people are really thinking about the intersections of climate justice and feminism. And, you know, I encourage people to kind of look at how they're talking about that.
Others want to follow up on that? Oh, go ahead.
I think what we can learn from climate activism is how young it is. So young people have decided to take the matter in their hands, and they were supported. And it's amazing because even though they were supported, the intergenerational gap between climate activists is not there. They are so together because they have one big focus on the goal they want to accomplish. So I think the feminist movements, as diverse as they are, they can learn from that. There's a whole intergenerational gap within the movement that sometimes stop the movement from being effective because of how the gap within the generations and not being on the same page. And I think another thing that we can learn from climate activism that I've found amazing is how so connected to today's words they are. So they were so effective because they got to realize how fast the world is moving and how they can use that to organize effectively. So they stood outside of their school. They organized themselves to even now they're still using posters on the internet saying care for the climate, care for Mother Earth. And that is important, that they get to even realize that there is another reality that is existent today that we should keep focusing on the work that we do. We can also learn that. But also the other thing is climate activism also intersect with feminism, intersect with women's movement. And climate activism is a feminist cause, it's a feminist movement. So at the end of the day, you get to realize how everything is a feminist thing, because feminism at the end of the day is a world where everybody is free, and nobody is free with climate change. So, and also gender comes also into play within that. So we can also learn on how the feminist movement also include a climate activism part into it, in supporting climate activism. And Leslie talked about it. We move beyond women and talk about gender. And when we talk about gender, it's above women. Even though women can be at the center, it's every other gender identities, including women. So we can also take from their organizing and include them, and also learn on how young they are. And the feminist movements can create a space for young people to feel included among its space, because most of the time young feminists organize on their own, and feminists who have been into this journey for some quite organize on their own. So they don't get to be in the same space together working on the same issues. And sometimes they say that it's not because they're not agreeing on a lot of things. I think there can be a space for disagreement, and both of generations really organizing together. It's important that mothers and daughters get to organize together. It's powerful, but also it's important.
Thank you for that. I think one of the submitted questions is such a powerful one for us to sort of do a last round on given our time, which is, what are the feminist visions, practices, and institutions that help us to see what a world beyond capitalism looks like, or a world beyond the patriarchy? I mean, to think back to Leslie's comments about the systems and structures that we're undoing, racism, the patriarchy, capitalism. So what are the visions, practices, and institutions that are currently in place that help us move to that next step? I am also going to really think about what those practices are. I'm going to drop another link into the chat box here. And so folks who are still following along from home, you can pick this link up and go talk, put in a word or two of yourself about what a feminist recovery in future looks like. And then we'll get a fun little word cloud at the end.
I talked about it earlier, Leslie. Desti, I talked on different ways I've been pushing myself to imagine. And I think imagination is such an amazing tool, especially when you are so marginalized. Sometimes you get so lost in inequalities all around you that it takes your time, that all that takes your time is how inequalities are shrinking you. So being able in the middle of a world that is not allowing you to fully prosper, to imagine a better world for you and to map it is important. So I think I practice a lot myself to dare to imagine a world where racism is not a thing, where patriarchy is not a thing, a world where I can walk on the streets at 10 p.m. and not being catcalled, or a world where my car can die on me in the middle of the highway. I won't be scared that random men can come and rape me. A world where I won't be scared to walk in the street and get shot because I'm Black. A world where I won't be discriminated because of homophobia. To dare to imagine a world where who I am as a person won't affect that I get to live or access certain rights. And to map that and to make it a reality in my home, even though I may not see it outside, to make it a thing in my world, that even in my home, at least I can try to create a reality where patriarchy is not a thing, a reality where racism is not a thing in my own house, a reality where homophobia, transphobia is not a thing. I think we should dare, and that daring start in our homes. Sometimes we talk about the revolution being something that is there. I think this pandemic have taught me about the revolution being here. It starts in our own homes. And it starts in our imaginations, in our friendships, in with our kids, with our sisters, with our family, with our friends. We dare to imagine and we dare to apply it. We dare to align our imaginations and our politics with what we want to see every day. And we work towards that, one a day at a time. We try to make it a reality. So I try to make a board of different realities that I want to live, to say that I'm a free person, and I try to walk towards them. It's an everyday work, it's an everyday try, but I make it a reality. At least Angela Davis said you have to act as if it's possible to radically change the world, and you have to do it every day. Even when you know it's not possible, you have to wake up and dare to believe that, today we can truly abolish institutionalized racism. I think that's what the generations before us, they believed it. They really believed it. They died for it. They knew it was possible. Even when still now we still believe it's possible. Even when we may not see it, our kids will believe it's possible, but we must dare to imagine it and try it in our own homes. And we must dare to write. So books, I think another way to imagine is to write. We must dare to create words and realities and language that embodies the freedom that we want. The newspaper we see, the movies we see, we must dare, to imagine all those realities. Write poems we read, presentations that we do, all these talks we are doing, we are daring to create, visions and realities that are different from what we are living. And I think that's the revolution, and that's where it starts.
What about other folks? What are the systems and structures in place to help us imagine what that next step looks like? One of the comments, hard to imagine what a post-capitalist world or a post-capitalist America looks like. So maybe we're not looking at America.
It does feel like a big question that I don't have a big answer, but I think that there's something about really watching some of the mutual aid projects like Presente Maine's Food Brigade, watching people caring for other people. They didn't wait for a big institutional endeavor. It wasn't, the United Way. It was like, oh my gosh, my friends are not going to have what they need, and we're going to fill that gap, like person to person. And then using arts and using tools, like it's not magical. I feel like sometimes saying it like person to person makes it seem easy. I don't think it's easy, the building of the new structure, but it is happening. And through crowdfunding, and I think some interplay of the tools of the old, like money is still in play, and then tools of the new, farmland being donated and food being grown. And so I have a sense that it's going to be fits and starts in some ways, making change, like a liminal space where we have feet in multiple worlds as we go forward. And in that way, we do have more agency, and so I think there will be a lot that happens. And I think that piece that Drew started with about reproductive labor, which gets talked about so little, and all of a sudden, caregiving and finding language to talk about caregiving as both a pleasure and a labor, or finding a new way to think about labor as pleasure and still labor. I don't even know, I think that as I figure out how to talk about what caregiving means and why I want the government to support me in it and why I want my employer to support me in it. And, I hope that new ways of resistance come and new systems, that we build new systems just by saying, I am going to pay attention to my older parents. Like that's going to be part of how I spend my time, and you can't stop me. Oh, capitalism? Like, I don't know, that falls apart, but something in there.
I think the idea, though, of straddling the two worlds is just real for so many of us who are doing, here at the Women's Lobby, we're a legislative advocacy organization. That means we are, by definition, bound within the constructs of what's possible in legislative advocacy, and must, at the same time, understand what a vision for a really radically different future looks like and be working toward it. So there's the minute in this moment, what a, childcare credit, like how possible is that today? And how do we have a world where care is valued? So I wanna give Leslie and Drew, who haven't had a chance to talk about that, as we sort of wind toward the end. What are those systems and structures that help us imagine the future that we want to see? And also a reminder to other folks that you can answer this question too, and then I'll show you a fancy word cloud at the end. Also, no pressure. What's giving you hope?
Well, while they're thinking, I'll just add one more thing, which is that I do think we've seen, and it's hard in the, like right now, the pandemic, you know, feels really isolating in some ways, but there's been so much actual activism and visioning. And, you know, I feel like when I think about what happened around Kavanaugh or what happened around, yeah, there's been so many moments where there has been more protest and more unbelievable scholarship and books written and poetry and arts. And so I do feel like there's visioning happening alongside really courageous direct action. And that like it's all, you know, it will be somebody else's history, somebody else, the current Audre Lorde is out there now in a way that someone else will come back to, but we're just right in the middle of it.
What part of what gives me hope is young people who have not, I mean, part of what they've experienced in their lifetimes. I'm thinking about the age group that I typically engage with when I'm teaching, and they have experienced, maybe those who are into their 20s have experienced 9/11, the 2008, 7, 8, 9 Great Recession, the election of Donald Trump, and now this. And I think those things have, one, shaped how they think about the world and how they think about the pressures they face individually, but larger questions about what the future should look like. They also are unfortunately having, through an unfortunate set of circumstances, having to build a muscle of resilience. I think they have the capacity to be one of the most resilient generations in a century because of those kinds of things. I also think that they may, not having fought some of the battles of feminist struggles that from the 1970s onward, particularly in the US, you know, fighting to get women's movement to recognize its various exclusions of sexual and gender difference, of different racialized experiences. They haven't been jaded by those kinds of battles. They've come into their thinking about feminism and movement and activism with a lot of the lessons that were learned from that. And so I agree with, it's not hard to, but Angela Davis, she did a talk in 2017 where she talks about young people as the hope of the future. And I think that's true. I think I see young people useful, and perhaps that means anybody under 35, anybody under 40, who've got the energy and the imagination and this stuff to look back at and to think about how to build a future. And in part, the kinds of crises that they face, in some ways, and if you add, you know, climate change to that, they're experiencing as existential issues in ways that many of the rest of us have not. And so that puts an urgency on to how they might come into some sort of activism or movement.
I want to, Drew, I want to give you an opportunity if you have a minute that you want to share your final thoughts, but.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I was just sort of thinking about in this conversation, I am putting this quote in the chat. I managed to find it in my email. But I was on a little Zoom thing and had the sort of heart palpitating honor to speak directly after Black feminist scholar and activist Barbara Ransby, who's like a sort of personal organizing hero of mine. And like gushing aside, she said this thing, which was that I believe in mutual aid. We got to help each other out, but we're not going to do it yourself out of this. Government needs to take some action. We can't let them off the hook, and they owe us. I'll be damned if I'm going to let them give $50 billion to corporations and not support our communities. And I think that, like, for me, the sort of dualities of this feel really, really important in how we're thinking about approaching this moment in particular, and sort of like movement building in general, which is we need to do mutual aid. We need to be practicing the world that we want to live in and how we want to treat each other and how we act collectively. I think that stuff is a practice, and it is very contrary to culture under neoliberalism. But we also need to be thinking about how are we actually building power to make demands on the state. And the only way, I did a lot of work in New Orleans just after Hurricane Katrina, and it really honestly changed me from an anarchist to a Marxist, because what I saw in that moment is that we had to figure out how to be able to build to scale, and the state was the only apparatus we had to figure that out. But we have to be able to make demands on the state to act in ways that actually protect our communities. And so I think like we need to be holding both of these things at the same time. And I think especially in this moment, like how are we taking care of each other? How are we practicing living in the world that we want to live? And it's really clear that like our government does not care if a whole lot of us die. And we need to be like building as much power to put demands on the state to like shift that, because our like the lives of ourselves and people we love are at stake in this moment.
I thank you for sort of putting the urgency to that last moment, because it is an urgent time, and I had a couple private chats about that urgency as well. So as we close out, I want to thank you all for bringing such interesting ideas and wisdom and lessons and tactics and strategies, and your urgency to this conversation, because we really are in a moment, as you've all said. This is what the audience has shared both on Facebook and today about what this recovery and what our future needs to look and feel like. And I hope that we keep having these conversations. Of course, we at the Women's Lobby, like this is part of our work and our bread and butter, but we would be happy to keep convening them or to show up to your conversations. This is, you know, for all of you and for the folks in the audience, because this is the work that needs to happen, to be organizing and connecting together so that we have a world that centers care and people and reparations and health and courage, as we see here on the screen. So I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I appreciate your time so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Dusty.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. It's really, really wonderful to be part of this panel of people.
I want that as a poster.
Yeah.
Share it. I will be very happy to share it. So stay tuned to Instagram and we'll get this right up there.
Great.
All right. Judicaelle, Drew, Kim, Leslie, PMA, thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.